Rule number 1. If at any point between the first 2 hours of nightfall you smell burning, then whatever you do, don't follow the smell. If you do, you will see something horrible and diabolical, and you will never be able to forget what you've seen. It will haunt you for the rest of your days. Trust me. Rule number 2. The more you walk away from the source, the smell will change and begin to get worse. You will start to smell burning flesh. If you smell this, then hold your breath and run away from the smell. Get to higher ground or a large clearing, where you are away from the trees. I was going against both of these rules right now. Did they even count now? Was this a dream, or hallucination, or was this real? Lord knows what Miles did to me once this stuff knocked me out. And colors were strong. Sounds echoed in the open air. My perception was a little off and I found myself stumbling up a slight incline, following the main trail. And the smell. This smell of which could only be described as a cocktail of singed hair, bubbling skin and scorching tendons. It was coming from the east. I made my way over to the trees and noticing a small off-the-trail path leading down into the dark forest. I took a deep breath and through my mouth and made my way towards it. The path led downhill for about 150 yards before leveling out for another 200 yards or so. I was struggling to keep my head upright, using tree trunks to prop myself up when my legs weren't working as a team. One of the trees that I rested against had something carved into the trunk, a love heart, with Cupid's arrow shooting through it. The initials H and M were inside. I wasn't sure why, but I considered this to be significant, so I made sure that I made a mental note of it. It was hard amongst the constant shift and contrast of the forest colors, as well as the shift in my vision, my shaky knees and the stench burning my nostrils. But in the drop of a hat, the stumbling, my self-induced psychosis, and the smell of burning meat suddenly stopped. It was now replaced with a sound, the sound of a screaming, a child screaming. It was in the distance somewhere, but approaching and fast. They were screaming out in sheer terror, begging for help, like a baby gazelle would if being pursued by a pack of hungry cheetahs. I stood frozen still, just outside of a clearing, no more than 10 meters from the tree line, and I waited. The sound of leaves crunching and branches snapping came like rapid gunfire in a large-scale war. The screams hadn't stopped either. If anything, they had intensified, and they were close, extremely close. There it was, darting in and out of the trees in the distance, desperately running towards the clearing. A small boy, no older than 8. I took a step towards him, about to call him over to me, when I saw it. Something was chasing him. Rule number 4. If you encounter him, he will stare at you. He will smile with excitement. Whatever you do, don't make a noise and never break eye contact. If you try to scream for help, you will find that your voice is muted. He will snatch your leg and begin to drag you into the woods. At this point, there is nothing much you can do. This thing was a jagged black mass, completely opaque, and gave the impression that even simply brushing up against it would tear you to ribbons. It had arms and claws like jet black branches in the autumn, talons on its hands and feet that would make Freddy Krueger jealous. Its face, though, the sinking feeling when I saw it, that painfully wide smile, those dagger-like fangs, those wide white eyes and those pinned black pupils, that look of excitement and obscene hunger. It was Keller. The child was tripping and stumbling as the adrenaline turned his legs to jelly. Keller could have caught him at any point, but he didn't. He was playing with him, no doubt waiting until they were in my view. As soon as the kid hit the clearing, Keller picked up the pace rapidly. That poor child never stood a chance. I stood there like a stiff coward, while the boy was pinned to the floor face down. The thing mounted his back and began to taste its food, licking the kid's face and smelling his hair as if teasing itself, working itself up into a frenzy. And then just like that, its head snapped up and glared in my direction. I remembered Rule 4 and just stared right back. Jesus Christ, this was so intense and so purely terrifying. I had to fight to stop my tears. I stared into those violent and remorseless eyes, while they just stared right back. All the while, the child squirmed and shrimped, desperately trying to struggle free. But it was no use. And despite how hard the child thrashed underneath Keller, he remained perfectly still. It was so disturbing and downright unsettling. I felt like I was holding my breath. How long was this going to go on for? My eyes started to burn and I dared not to blink, but he just kept staring right into my soul. My body was screaming for me to look away. My eyes began to lubricate themselves in a desperate attempt to stop my corners from bursting into flames. The tears began to tickle and irritate my face, causing my cheekbones to spasm. But I kept staring back. And then, just as I was about to cave, the figure scoffed. And then I swore to God it winked at me, and the child was dragged kicking and screaming into the tree line. I pathetically held my hand out in some futile attempt for him to grab. It was more symbolic. I was nowhere near him and I couldn't have saved him even if I was. I was petrified. I could not move. He dug his fingers into the dirt and raked the ground with them, as Keller pulled him towards the base of a tree. I watched in horror as the mass began to sink into the ground and proceeded to take the child with him. I'll never forget that look the child gave me just before his face had disappeared under the dirt. It was as if I was totally invisible to him, right up until that moment. But just before he sunk under the ground, to be subjected to God only knows what at the hands of that creature, he saw me. His eyes widened in a moment of hope and plea for his safety. But when he saw that I wasn't coming to his aid, his face contorted into a confused state. Why? I don't know, kid, I don't know. I'm so sorry. His last attempt at clinging on for life ended when his fingers slipped off the ground and his arm disappeared under the soil. Then his hand, then his finger. And soon as the tip of his index finger went under and he was gone, it was as if the fear and stiffness had gone. I was free to move and to think for myself again. I ran as quickly as I could to the disturbed earth where I last saw the child and I began to dig. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. It wouldn't let me help you. God, I'm sorry. I'm coming now, please hold on. I rambled apologies at the half-dug hole as I clawed the earth up with my bare hands. As I frantically threw dirt over my shoulder, digging a hole of approximately half a meter deep, I was praying, hoping, and begging to whatever God was listening that I wasn't too late. Then, with one more mighty scoop of dirt, I uncovered his hand, still desperately clutching at thin air. With a surge of hope and adrenaline, I grabbed a hold of his hand just before it sunk below the earth once again. The sinking force was strong enough to continue pulling the child's hand underground, and now mine too. The earth was up to my forearm. I began to panic and drive my feet into the ground, desperately pulling for my life. It was either let go and live, but let this child sink down below, or put myself at risk and try to save his life. It was at this point I remembered, this was induced. Maybe if I was woken up by Miles while holding the child, he would be saved. After all, it worked in Nightmare on Elm Street. I held on for dear life and started to scream. "Miles, wake me up! Wake me up!" The more that I screamed, though, the more the force began to pull me down. I could feel the desperation in the child's hand as it squeezed my hand so tight. He was either in pain or running out of air, but whatever was pulling us down was clearly getting desperate too. That told me this would work. "Miles, give me the shot! Can you hear me? Come on!" I was screaming louder and louder, when suddenly, the pulling stopped. No more resistance. It took a moment for it to register, but once it did, I pulled that kid up with all of my might. I looked up at the sky as I used all my body to drag the child out of the dirt. As I felt the earth break, I smiled up at the full moon, proud of my efforts. "You all right, kid? Come on, let's get out of here," I said, breathless. There was no response, though. No crying, no whimpering, no nothing. There was a part of me that didn't want to look down. I mean, why bother? To see a still, motionless child with that hopeless and confused expression still tattooed on his vacant face, questioning why I didn't do better for him. The soil that had robbed him of his last breath, still overflowing from every orifice. "Kid, come on, say something, please." Still nothing. I kept staring up. A tear began to run down my face. "Please," I whimpered. "Max is a little tied up right now, James." A harsh, gargling voice hissed up from below. My skin went hot to touch and my sweat almost turned to ice. Now I really didn't want to look down. I began to shake, desperately trying to remember the rules and if one could help me. "Screw yourself, Keller," I shouted into the air, defiantly. A brief pause before he began to chuckle. "Now why would I do that, when I've got little Max down here?" "Leave him alone," I screamed, snapping my head down to face him. "Gotcha." Keller's smile and wide eyes lit up as he yanked my arm hard, pulling me headfirst into the dirt. I seemed to have soil thrust into my face for around 20 full seconds before it eventually stopped. I fell on my back hard, the sound of wood lats bouncing off springs underneath me. I spluttered out what dirt I could from my mouth and nose before realizing what had happened. In an instant of sudden panic, I sat up sharply. I was in my cabin again. Was this still a dream, or a hallucination, or whatever the heck it was? Or had Miles seen that I was in distress and woke me up? I looked around for him. "Miles?" I asked tentatively, as I looked around the room. A draft from the right side of the room caught my attention as it chilled my cheek. The window was open, and I also noticed the clock read at 3:43 a.m. Crap. Rule number 5. If you have a vivid nightmare about children being pursued by a menacing presence and you wake up between the hours of 3 and 4 in the morning, you will find that one of your windows are open, even if you remember locking it. If you notice this, grab whatever belongings you can and leave the cabin. The smell of rotten meat and bad breath began to hug the back of my neck. Never look behind you, no matter what you hear. Never turn around. You will wish that you were dead. That same rough, gurgling voice began to speak up from behind. "I'm going to kill you all, James. All of the pieces are starting to fall into place, and the day is coming when I won't need you to be asleep to come for you. When these stupid rules can't help you in your darkest hours. When I'm not bound to these woods without the fear of outsiders. I promise you, if your turn now, I'll make it quick. Quicker than most, anyway. But if you fight it, I will make you and your new adopted daddy Philip suffer. Oh, you will beg for me to end it. I promise you. You will beg. Like I made Billy beg. Like I made those children beg. Like I'm still making Michael Atwood beg." I closed my eyes tight so as not to see anything. You're a liar. Just go die all over again. You evil piece of crap. I shouted forward defiantly. Keller's chuckle in response caused me to have a spurt of anger and frustration. I began kicking and thrashing as I felt two hands grip around my arms. The breathing intensified, as did mine. A piercing sensation stung my right arm and then my left. No doubt, Keller's grip tightening on me. I waited for him to make me beg. I thought of my dad. I'll see you soon, big man. James! A gush of cold water hit my face, causing me to split my eyelids a millimeter. A figure was standing over me, shaking me by the arms. You okay, kid? I was asked as my vision became clearer. The figure was not Keller, it was Miles. A sudden awareness of the fact that my hands were shaking, my heart was pounding and I could barely breathe, caused me to panic and fall off the side of the bed. Whoa, here. Come on, kid. Just take some nice, big deep breaths. 3 seconds in and a second out. Here, watch me. He began to simulate the breathing exercise for me to mimic. I took his advice. Jesus, I felt like I was about to fly to the moon. It'll pass soon, kid. Just a few minutes, I'm sorry. I jabbed you, but you weren't waking up. You looked like you were in serious trouble, so I hit the other arm. You must have been in real deep. I stumbled back to my feet and sat on the edge of the bedside, trying to regain my composure. Yeah, well, like you said, not FDA approved, I quipped. James, our boys in the lab have tested this stuff 50 times over. 2 milligrams of epinephrine is more than enough to snap someone out of this stuff. Even with twice the dose that I gave you. Miles explained. Whatever you were kicking and screaming at, it had you real good there, he added. Yeah, you could say that, I said bluntly. So, what did you see? Miles asked, as he once again set up the recorder. I was a little taken aback by how quickly he dropped the bedside manner for business as usual. It must have shown on my face. Look, the quicker we record your feedback, the better you recall, nothing personal. I stared at him vacantly for a few seconds before licking the dry saliva from the inside of my lips. He told me that he was going to kill us all, Miles. The seriousness of my tone wasn't lost on him. In fact, he said the day was coming for when he wouldn't need his victims to be asleep in order to get to them. Miles turned off the recorder and sighed heavily. Miles. He looked up, a disturbed expression on his face. What is going on? Is there something you aren't telling us? I was concerned by the man's demeanor as I asked this question. There is more to this than a simple research expedition. I don't even know where to begin, James, Miles said, shrugging his shoulders. Well, maybe you can start with telling me what on earth Subject 16A is. Not what. Miles corrected as he lit up a much-needed cigarette. He took a long drag, held it back for a few seconds before blowing out the smoke, along with some of his bottled-up stress. Who? I'm lost, I proclaimed. Apparently, it likes to be called Braun now. I haven't seen him in nearly a year. Lives off the grid somewhere with some girl, a half-man, half-alligator creature known as the Orchestrator. Oh, and a frickin' Wendigo named Arya. I couldn't write this crap, could you? He opened the briefcase and pulled out that familiar blue folder. He opened it up and pulled out the file 5 pages down. My eyes bulged when I saw it. I'd only caught a glimpse of the photo before, but now I could see the entire thing. This thing had to be about 8 to 9 feet tall. It hung by its knees, which were themselves around 4 feet off the ground. Its claws were black as 2 in the goddamn morning, and as long and sharp as steak knives. Its skin was a mesmerizing royal blue with fluorescent yellow eyes that shone like light bulbs against the dark contrast of the photo's backdrop. Its teeth looked as dangerous as its claws. For the first time in over 10 months, I completely forgot all about Ed Keller. This photo's a little old and he's red now, Miles said with a slight chuckle. Red? I questioned. Yeah, his skin, it's red. Right, I said, unsure of how to really answer that. So, this is what killed that Yubel guy? I asked, remembering the report about Yubel's cause of death. Yeah, that's what the records show. Miles was deliberately vague. My expression turned to one of puzzlement. Yubel was fatally injured by a 16A, that's a fact. But before he could succumb to those injuries, he was shot in the chest with an SMG by one of our former scientists, Dr. Jonathan R. Dillard. My confused expression only intensified. Miles rubbed his face, trying to think how on earth to explain everything. Okay, so a little history lesson. Cryptids, they've always been a thing. Vampires, werewolves, the goatman, the Michigan dogman, all that crap. They're as real as you and me. They keep to themselves mainly, but they can be lethal if threatened or victims wander into their territory. Our agency was formed in 1967 to help control these creatures, make sure they stuck to their areas and put them down should they get over-aggressive. However, they were losing too many men. I've seen guys dragged underground kicking and screaming by giant spiders. Men pulled apart one by one at a time by mass tentacles. My own lieutenant was sucked dry by a giant vampire bat, right in front of me. So we needed something to even the odds, something to do all the heavy lifting. We simply provide backup and we clean up the mess. He was created by our head scientist, Dr. West. He was her masterpiece. Subject 16A was a game changer. He reduced human casualties by 91%. Unfortunately, there was a, falling out with him and our organization. Took off with the aforementioned Dr. Dillard and Wendigo. We searched everywhere for him, but he managed to evade us for a long time until, well, we got to the spa. The spa, I requested him to elaborate. Okay, so during our investigation into the black-robed people, we uncovered something really troubling. Like what? A book. One of 6. The contents were alarming to say the least. Miles said, his eyes widening to hammer home the point. What was in it? Pictures, symbols, all in some sort of ancient language. They talked about an entity known as the Five-Headed Witch and how to create it by using people in the real world. Young, innocent women. We thought it was just some BS concept at first, but this one night, our satellites picked up this huge output of radiation coming from this old abandoned spa. We thought something this big could only be this witch thing. So our agency deployed to the location to take it down. When we got there, the Wendigo and co were already there. I was too busy picturing how terrifying a 5-headed witch would actually be to even respond verbally. This thing was like nothing I had ever seen before. There is no way the group could take down this thing and the cult alone. So we agreed a truce and teamed up to defeat it. We lost men, good men, but we got the job done. Probably wouldn't be here to say those words if it wasn't for 16A. He turned up a little bit late to the party, but like I said, game changer. He not only saved my men's lives, but he ended up losing his best friend, the doctor that I was telling you about. He blasted himself in the chest with the same SMG that he killed Yubel with. He did this to kill the witch's physical tie to this world. For you see, Yubel in the black robes, one of the female sacrifices performed to create this thing, was Dr. John's own daughter. Yeah, like I said, a real piece of work. So, given their help and their sacrifice, 16A and his crew requested that we let them live out the rest of their days in peace. We honored that request, Miles said, with a firm nod, as if to say it was the least that we could do. Jesus, I said, unable to think of anything else. But you see, not all of the agency agrees with that and thinks that we should track him down and bring him back under our command. But everyone who was on that field that day know that we owe him our lives. So we doctored the reports to show that he had killed Yubel, mainly to buy him some goodwill with the higher levels of the agency. And up until recently, that was the case. Up until recently, I quoted, looking for elaboration. Miles shifted to face me head on. A hint of fear to his serious face piqued my attention. Yeah, you see, after the battle, when our cleanup crew arrived, 2 bodies were missing. The body of Dr. Jonathan R. Dillard and Yubel's. The doctor was beloved to 16A and his crew, so it's very likely they took the body to give him a proper burial. The Yubels were extremely concerned that the black-robed people collected the body. Deeply concerned. Miles gazed as he said the word deeply, and it told me that it was likely an understatement. Well, maybe they just took him to bury him too, given how he was their leader and all, I speculated. Every other black-robed casualty were left behind. We think they're planning something much bigger and much more terrifying. I sit up off the bed, made my way over to the kitchen counter and started to pour myself and Agent Black a coffee, letting everything that he said process. Meanwhile, Miles finished his cigarette. I sat back down at the kitchen table, sliding the fresh brew over to Miles before cradling my own, and swigging a mouthful down my dry throat. I see why Phil makes it Irish now. Really helps to take the edge off. So, why is this Yubel's body being missing concerning you? I quizzed Miles. And because the last words this guy said were, and I quote, "Even in my death, I will rip this world from you. Redwood, Yellowstone, Wolf Lake, we are everywhere. Here, look at these," Miles said, taking out another binder. This one was an off-tinted beige color and had a red, classified stamp on the front. There are copies of the other books that we have found during our investigation into the Black Robes and what they were up to. He fanned 6 pages across my table. I looked down at them, in pure, unadulterated horror. There were 6 images, which looked like they had been hand-drawn. They reminded me of these sketches that you see in an old fairy tale book. The images were of 6 different humanoid creatures. 2 immediately caught my eye. The first was a shaded mass, levitating in midair in a bipedal stance. Along with its own, it also had 4 other heads, with long, unkempt hair, in place of its feet and hands. No doubt, this was the 5-headed wedge. I looked at the next image. This one made me gulp hard. It was a dark, spiky black mass. It looked like a toddler had drawn it with his crayon, unable to keep it within the lines. The wide eyes, the big smile, the razor-sharp teeth and claws. The drawing showed a tree in the background, with 3 bodies hanging upside down from the branches. There was no doubt. That was Keller. I inspected the others. Jesus, they all looked as sinister as each other. One of the drawings was that of a human-looking creature, except its face was extremely distorted. Its face was almost like a spiral. The eyes and mouth completely out of place, but I could tell that this thing was happy and smiling. Its torso was open like a zeb, with 4 spiked tentacles protruding from the black abyss deep within its gut. The image depicted 2 small children to be running from the creature. One was still running away, but the other child seemed to have been caught, and had one of the tentacles wrapped around his leg, and it was being dragged, screaming and crying, towards the creature. The image stoked a memory within me. The young child from Glaciers. After she and her brother went missing, she was later found by the search and rescue team, but her brother was never seen again. We were playing hide and seek when the man with the funny face said he wanted to play. When you say funny face, what do you mean funny? Oh, his face was like my paintings at school when it gets smudged. It didn't seem to bother him though. He was smiling and dancing a lot. They call this one the chameleon, Miles informed. I moved my view to the right and winced at the sight of the next picture. The next one was a pale humanoid with a demonic, goblin-type appearance. Its eyes were like golf balls with its pupils pinned and wild. Its ears and nose were sharp and pointed. Its lips pouted and musical notes were sketched projecting from its mouth. The sketch also showed two human figures approaching, as if they were following the sound this thing was producing. The drawing depicted the creature rubbing its hands together with an extremely sinister and excited look on its face. The Whistler. Miles coined the entity, as I glared at its horrific image, causing another jog in my memory. The story that the Redwood Ranger told me about those two female hikers. At this point, the girls claimed they got a little freaked out but just assumed it was a passing hiker. However, after another few short minutes, they could hear the whistling again. This time, it was right outside of the tent. I didn't say anything to Miles. Instead, I just turned my attention to the next image. This one was probably the most disturbing of the bunch. The figure was half humanoid, half arachnid. The figure was nude and stood upright on its bottom four limbs. It held a small child by the collar of its shirt in one of its arms, kicking and screaming for its life. The child looked in pure agony. In the creature's opposing arm, its claw was in the shape of a pair of pliers with a tooth clamped in its grasp. Jesus freaking Christ, I gasped. The dentist. Miles chipped in, once again giving me the name of the creature that I was looking at. As soon as he told me the name, another flashback hit me. Rice Clutterbuck, a search and rescue operative in the Appalachian Trail, recounting his encounter with an unidentified figure during his search for a group of missing Boy Scouts. We were too busy looking for a person sneaking up on us that we didn't even notice what was all around us. I was backing up when something tickled my neck and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I turned and shone my torch on it and I was sickened by what I saw. Hanging from branches on around 20 random trees in this clearing were missing person posters. Each one of them was one of the 18 missing Boy Scouts and the 2 missing Scout leaders. The most insidious thing about it all was that, hanging from each poster, were like cotton balls. We pulled one down, laid it on the ground and shone our torches at it. We unraveled it and that's when we realized that it was a Boy Scout neckerchief. That's not even the worst part. Inside each one, there were 3 teeth, a molar, a canine, and an incisor, all covered in dried blood. I turned away from the ghastly drawing and looked at the next image. This one was a winged figure. It had the appearance of a deer except it was bipedal and humanoid. Its teeth were protruding from its mouth, and a pair of grotesque rows of bulging black teeth. Its antlers were jagged and wild, like stripped autumn tree branches. Its wings looked mainly bones with a small amount of torn deer flesh hanging over the supporting bone. Its hands weren't hooves though. They were hands covered in deer fur, and its nails were like steak knives. The picture depicted it dragging something in his left hand. It looked like a plastic bag, except with eyes and mouth cut into the top of it. It wasn't until I inspected the drawing further and saw the depiction of a child's skeleton on the floor in its wake. That's when I realized it was skin. "Meet the Flayer," Miles said. "Death Valley 03, I thought out loud. As soon as it left my mouth, I knew that it was too late to take it back. That's right." Miles was confused and directed a look towards me that told me that I had messed up. "How do you know that?" He demanded to know, and I knew there was no way out, so I sighed heavily. "No names," I demanded, making him aware that I wasn't going to be dropping anyone in hot water. Miles nodded in agreement. In Alaska, I met some other rangers, some from the parks where these entities are residing. I heard stories about these 3, I confessed, sliding the pages that related to the chameleon, the whistler, and the dentist. slightly towards Miles. That one's your 5-headed witch, I deduced, pushing the witch's page in line with the other 3 before adding. And this one here is Keller, I informed him, sliding the image into the pile with the rest. I tapped my finger on the chameleon, glaciers, then on the dentist, the Appalachian Trail, then on the Whistler, Redwood, and then on Keller, Wolf Lake. And that leaves a Death Valley for this one, I concluded, tapping the image of the angel. Miles nodded slowly before starting to shake his head. He looked furious. I must have had a sheepish look on my face because Miles picked up on it. I'm not mad that they told you, I'm mad because you won't be the only person that they tell. These things, they all feast on fear and pain. These idiots start telling ghost stories to the public and soon we have another Death Valley on our hands. We need to keep these things contained until we can find a solution. Miles, if it makes it any better, they didn't even really want to tell me. They only shared it because I shared about Keller. No outsiders was kind of their motto, I assured him. He seemed to have to accept this and the anger drained from his face. The Smiler. Sorry? Keller, according to these pages, they call them the Smiler. I stared down at the drawn image of the entity that Keller was inhabiting. The spiky black mass, the wide and painful smile, the razor-sharp teeth, the cartoonishly wide pinned eyes. I found myself staring into the violent expression on the face of the drawing so much that it caused my brain to flash back to the horrific dream I had just experienced. Seeing that same face staring up at me from that hole in the ground, I couldn't help but shudder. I shook it off and changed the subject. So, sorry, what's this Yubal's body got to do with all of this? I asked. They tried to take over the world by creating that 5-headed witch. It was the only one of these creatures that they could create with a physical tie to the real world. They created the entity by sacrificing 4 young females, but they set it free on the world when they sacrificed Dr. John Dillard's daughter to create the 5th head. Okay, I said, waiting for the bombshell. An anthropologist who examined these texts claimed there's a passage in the text that describes a ritual in which the most powerful of the entities can be given a physical body if a vessel of equal unspeakable evil is sacrificed. Okay, my responses were becoming extremely limited. All these entities are equal in concept, but depending on the human sacrifice to birth them, one can become the alpha male, so to speak. And let me guess. Keller, yup. He could barely look me in the eye, knowing the stuff this thing had already put me through. Look, those guys that I showed you from the Kettle Moraine cult, they were bad people. They kidnapped a young woman and killed them for no reason. But they had more than enough evil in them to be suitable vessels for these things. But Keller, that's a different league. There's no bigger middle finger to God than the brutal slaying of 20 kids. The Black Robes lost their leader, their friends. They're going to be angry. If they have these books, and given how they have raised every single one of these things, it's a big possibility. Then they could use Yubel to give Keller a path into the real world. And if he does, he can bring the others with him. Miles began to get a tad emotional. He clearly was weighing all of this on his shoulders for some time now. So if that day comes, what are we going to do? I asked, desperate to know if this world was doomed. If that day comes, and it will, it's the end of everything good and pure in this world. Miles said frankly, if we can't stop Keller here at Wolf Lake before any of this becomes real, then there's only one play that we have, Miles said, looking up at me right in the eye. What is it? I asked, looking at him right back. Subject 16A.